You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, and we are at Georgetown University interviewing some of their professors who are also authors. And now joining us is Charles Kupchan, who is the author of this new book, No One's World, The West, The Rising Rest, and the Coming Global Turn. It's published by Oxford. Professor Kupchan, what do you mean by global turn?
By global turn, I refer to a period in history in which the world's center of gravity moves. The last global turn was when the world was relatively multipolar, but arguably the center of gravity was in the Mesopotamian Valley, India, China. It was to the east. And then beginning in the late medieval period, let's say 1300, you began to see commercialism rise in Europe. New cities were born. You begin to see a middle class, a bourgeoisie. And by roughly 1800, Europe was dominant. And so the pendulum had swung from Istanbul, from Delhi, from that part of the world up to Northern Europe. And what I'm arguing in this book is that pendulum has started to swing again. And that's because we see power moving from the West, that is to say North America and Europe, and it's heading east, but it's not just heading east, and that's why I call the book No One's World. I don't think that any country, region, or model will dominate. In fact, I think we're headed to a world that for the first time in history will be interdependent, globalized, but without a political anchor.
Why do these turns take so long? You're talking about a turn since the 17th and 18th centuries. You're talking about the next turn that we're in.
Well, I think that this turn will actually be the fastest turn ever because we live in the digital age and we're seeing how quickly China is growing, how quickly they're catching up economically with the United States. And consequently, the degree to which globalization brings fast economic change to the U.S. We've lost roughly half of our manufacturing jobs in the last 10 years, in part because economic activity is moving so quickly elsewhere. But in general, what happens is today's core, over time, becomes tomorrow's periphery. Today's periphery becomes tomorrow's core. And that's because if we look historically, really as far back as we can go, you see that great powers don't stay on top forever, and that their innovation, their know-how, gradually moves to other regions that are less developed. And over time, they are able to catch up with the core, and they end up being in a hegemonic position, in a dominant position. Then that cycle starts all over again. You're right to say that this last turn occurred quite slowly. The U.S. and the Europeans have effectively been atop the heap since about 1815, when the Napoleonic Wars ended. So we've had about 2 centuries, which is a pretty good run. And I think what we're headed to now is a world that for most of the 21st century won't have a dominant player. And that's an interesting world. It's not that different than where we were in, say, 1600, when you had the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottomans, the Mughals, the Japanese Empire, the Chinese Empire. But the key difference is, in the 1600s, those imperial zones didn't penetrate. They rarely interacted with each other, so that they could each kind of go according to their own. What's happened now is we're all smushed together. What we do here, what China does, what happens in India affects us. And that's why this next world is going to be complicated, because we need to agree on a set of rules in ways that we have never before.
Charles Kupchan, how is it that Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries became dominant?
I think the story starts with the end of feudalism. And to some extent, Europe's strength was its weakness. Because when the feudal structure began to erode, suddenly you saw new towns, small towns emerge, and they were populated by artisans, like blacksmiths, by the beginnings of what you might call professional people, bankers. And then over time, those cities became the vanguard of a commercial revolution. And economic activity, debt instruments, banks, little workshops that eventually became laboratories, they were able to thrive because they pushed back against the nobility, the monarchy, and the church. In the rest of the world, empires were much stronger and they were able to maintain centralization. And therefore, what you saw in Europe, the fragmentation of traditional institutions, the birth of the bourgeoisie, a bourgeoisie that embraced the Protestant Reformation, which slowly pushed the Catholic Church out of politics and led to sort of a secular realm. All of that happened only in Northern Europe. It then crossed the Atlantic and happened here in the United States. But it led to a period in which technologically and economically the Western world pulled far ahead of the competitors, and that technology also allowed them to penetrate the competitors. We had better ships, better navigation, and so by the end of the 1800s, by the end of the 19th century, the West dominated about 80+% of the world. And that's really something that is historically unique.
Some would argue that the 1970s, late 1970s and 1980s, when Japan was on the rise and becoming a dominant economic power, could have been a turn.
Well, I think that though the turns that we've seen in the last several decades have been turns within the family, that is to say, among countries, all of whom kind of look the same. That is to say, they're liberal democracies, they have industrialized economies. And so if we sort of say, well, what's happened over the last, say, 50, 60, 70 years, Europe, the US, and Japan have competed to be the top dog. What I think is happening now is the circle is widening. There are now many new cooks in the kitchen, and the Western model, industrial capitalism, liberal democracy, secular nationalism, is being called into question. And that's in part because the West hasn't been doing so well. We are seeing political polarization in the US. We're seeing fragmentation in Europe. Japan has been stuck in an economic recession for 2 decades. And a lot of that is the product of globalization. We are seeing jobs leave. We don't have as much control over our economies as we used to. And so the broad middle classes in the West, in the US and Europe and Japan, are not very happy. And they are saying to their governments, hey, help me. I don't like this situation. And those governments are finding it very hard to respond. And that's why we see in the United States trust in government is hitting historic lows. That's why in Europe we see a renationalization of political life away from the European Union. And all the while we see other models that are actually doing pretty well. State capitalism in China. They are growing at about 10% a year, whereas the US is stuck at around 2%. And they're not going to keep growing at 10%, but the success of their model does raise questions about whether we're heading to a world in which no model dominates, in which Western democracy, Western capitalism will have to compete in the marketplace with other kinds of models, China being one, the Persian Gulf another, a left-wing populism in Latin America being a third. And I think all of these have advantages and disadvantages, and that leads to a world in which the playing field will be much more level than it has been.
Do you see the China model or the Middle East model, Professor Kupchan, as ideological models rather than just pure economic models? And are people going to look to those like they've looked to the West in the past?
Well, I would say that they're a combination of ideology and socioeconomic foundations, and I think the two are hard to untangle. So let's just take China for a second. What is so different about China's trajectory than the West? Well, as we were talking about a few minutes ago, in the West, the middle class was the vanguard of change. They really drove economic growth and they pushed back against the absolutist state. The Chinese state is much smarter than the old monarchies of Europe because the monarchies of Europe tried to keep down the middle class. The Communist Party, the so-called Communist Party, because they're not particularly communist, has integrated the middle class. They have made them stakeholders in the state. And so if you were to talk to most entrepreneurs, most professionals in China, They don't want to change the system. They're happy. And that raises the question, well, is this stable? If those with the wealth and power to change